Can MBS ride out the storm? Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed Bin Salman defiant over threats of sanctions after the disappearance of Jamal Khashogghi. There's growing outrage over the fate of the Saudi journalist who's not been seen since walking into his consulate in Istanbul nearly 2 weeks ago. How do you punish, though, the nation that sits on 1/3 of the planet's oil reserves? Silicon Valley giants and U.S. lawmakers talk of reviewing ties with the Saudis, but the president flat out refusing to call into question a bond sealed by mega arms deals and a common enmity for Iran. Just how much influence does Saudi money buy? And why did Khashoggi feel he posed enough of a threat to the leadership in Riyadh that he'd gone into self-imposed exile? We're going to go over his views and the latest on the case, including that joint visit of the consulate in Istanbul by Saudi and Turkish authorities. Today in the France 24 debate, the pressure on Saudi Arabia. Joining us from Washington, Karen Young, resident scholar with the American Enterprise Institute think tank. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Here in the studio, we welcome back Assiem El-Difraoui, fellow at the Candid Foundation. Thanks for joining us as well. He's an academic, former defense ministry advisor. Pierre Coneza, the author of The Saudi Terror Machine, which is out now in English.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. And from Beirut, Lebanese TV host Nadim Kotesh, columnist for the London-based Saudi newspaper Asharq Al-Awsat. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks a lot.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Yeah, let's start with the latest. Donald Trump dispatching his Secretary of State to Saudi Arabia. Trump, who's facing increasing pressure to act over the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Anka Ula has more.
2 weeks after Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance, Turkish inspectors set foot for the first time in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, the last place the prominent journalist was seen alive. It was a joint inspection with Saudi Arabia. But with cleaners going in and out of the building ahead of the search, it's unclear if any evidence still remains. Saudi Arabia's King Salman ordered an internal probe on Monday as well, as he tries to quell the growing international backlash against his kingdom. Turkish officials have avoided publicly pointing the finger at Riyadh, but behind closed doors, fears are growing that a Saudi hit team murdered Khashoggi, an outspoken critic of the Saudi crown prince. Riyadh calls the accusations baseless, but has been unable to explain what happened to the journalist. U.S. President Donald Trump dispatched Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Riyadh and called for a probe into the disappearance of Khashoggi, a U.S. permanent resident. But he stopped short of placing the blame on Riyadh.
The king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows? We're going to try getting to the bottom of it very soon, but his was a flat denial.
The incident has also hit Saudi Arabia's investment conference later this month, as more and more global business leaders drop out of the event. The CEOs of JP Morgan Chase and Ford are the latest to cancel plans to attend.
Maybe these could have been rogue killers, said Donald Trump. Assiem El-Difraoui, your reaction?
You know, it's only speculation from the side of Donald Trump, but obviously there's a media and disinformation war going on, you know. For most of the people in the world, it seems clear that at least there was a hijacking attempt. But for instance, Saudi, with their influential media, blame now Turkey, Qatar, you know, in a kind of conspiracy theory. A rogue attempt with 2 Learjets flying into Istanbul airport seems to be a little wide guess.
Pierre Coneza, what do you make of the latest developments, especially this joint team going into the consulate in Istanbul?
One must remember that Mr. Khashoggi is not the first guy kidnapped by the Saudi regime. It's the 5th or the 6th guy, and mainly people coming from the circle of the power, you know, people who are regarded as traitors because they were belonging to the Saudi system, and suddenly, you know, they balanced and they are opponents. So Mr. Khashoggi has been kidnapped, that's an evidence. And the second point is what probably the mistake of MBS is that he's a correspondent of American media. which is the most important aspect, because you know that the American media is a power that Trump can't control. So the campaign to denounce the regime in Saudi Arabia can't stop now. The MBS can't stop it.
The Turks suggesting he's been killed. What do you make of what Turkey's been saying about all this?
Well, you know, regarding the image and the TV transcription, I think that probably he has disappeared, which means that if we take an example of the former kidnapped people, some of them have never appeared again, which means that they have disappeared, so have been probably killed in Saudi Arabia, which means that nobody will have some news of Khashoggi now. So I think the history is finished. What had happened exactly, we don't know, but the history is finished. The Saudi regime can't suddenly say, no, I will discover him, he's living there, etc., he's free. No. The regime is in the blockade now.
And Nadim Kotesh, you agree?
I completely disagree with that. Actually, first of all, let me start with saying that Jamal Khashogghi is a friend whom I know for the past 18 years. And my thoughts are with his family, with his beloved ones, and I wish from the bottom of my heart that he will appear alive, sound, and safe. I think what we are witnessing in this show and in the past 12 days is the same circus of jumping into conclusions and jumping into expectations. It has been an expectation game for the past 12 days at least. And linking this issue directly to MBS or Mohammed Bin Salman, it's just an opinion that is not supported by any sort of facts, at least up till now.
Well, we have the facts of those two teams that went. We have those two teams that came in and that flew out the same day on two separate flight paths. Those are facts.
No, these are not facts. These are totally not facts. And if you allow me just to give you two of the names that Al Jazeera and other outlets have been, promoting as the killing, the assassination squad, like a Mission Impossible movie. Tubayqi is one of them. They highlighted his name, they highlighted his image, and it turned out that Tubayqi died 2 years ago. Another one is Mr. Zahrani, the guy who they said is basically the personal bodyguard of MBS, and they put, like, if you remember, certainly the guy whom they put circle around his face is Rakan Qubaisi, who is a big official in Saudi Arabia. So these are just two names of people. And even the Turkish media today, Hurriyet newspaper said that one of the photos that have been used over the past 12 days as a smoking gun evidence against Saudi Arabia is basically taken in 2013 for a Saudi tourist. It's not me saying that. It's
all right, but what's fact is that he walked into the Saudi consulate. We have the CCTV footage to prove it. His fiance was with him, and then he never came out.
Sorry. You mean Jamal Khashoggi? I
Yes.
misinterpret what you're saying. I thought you're saying about Zahrani. Yes, this is definitely a very interesting point. So far, this is probably the weakest point in the Saudi narration. But what I know from the Saudi officials whom I talked to, from the open statements of the Saudi ambassador in Washington and the royal court in Saudi Arabia, figuring out what happened to Jamal Khashoggi is the number one priority. The king said that. Mohammed Bin Salman said that to Bloomberg. The ambassador in Washington said that. And now we are in front of a very professional joint investigation done by the Turks and the Saudis, and another investigation ordered today by King Salman after talking to the U.S. President Donald Trump. That is an internal investigation. So I think we are on the right track now after the 12-day circuit that turned out basically with so many unfounded leaks that have been collapsing one after another.
Yeah, right. So they're going in. Asiem El Difraoui, they're going in 13 days, of course, after he disappeared.
No, I think it's very interesting, like the statement of the gentleman from Lebanon, in a sense, like he illustrates perfectly well in which kind of media war we're in. Do you know, this gentleman is working for a Saudi-owned newspaper, and he's making himself to a mouthpiece of Saudi opinions. He doesn't leave even possibilities open for the doubt. And Saudi Arabia created many years ago by buying fairly respected papers in the hopes they will stay respectful, like Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, like Al-Hayat, some kind of media shield, some kind of media shield around the Arab world. Here, this gentleman is voicing no doubt even that there was a possibility that the Saudis did. And people who are going to be paid by the Saudi royal family largely, it's very shocking for me that we give, for example, so much airtime to things which are just defending the Saudi point of view, pretending to be great friend of Jamal Khashoggi, which I met a couple of times in my life as well.
And who's been a guest on
and we don't
on this
know.
show.
We have an open outcome, but I mean, like
we don't know. Nadim Kotesh, very briefly, because I want to move on. Your response.
I stated my point respectfully, and I think that your guest is entitled for, having his view through instead of, attacking me. It's better for him if he can enhance his argument.
Oh, we have many arguments, dozens of arguments, How would you explain his disappearances? Explain, give some reasonable explanation,
Go straight.
Could you give us some information about the previous kidnapped persons?
I mean, they kidnapped, the Lebanese prime minister, Hariri went to a holiday trip to Saudi Arabia, or what happened? Could you state, maybe do a comment of, could you comment how your prime minister disappeared for a couple of days?
Prime minister better than him.
Nadim Kotesh, the Skype gods are not with us. The connection with Beirut is deteriorating. We're gonna hang up and call you right back and bring you back on so we can hear you properly and respond. Let's go back again to what Donald Trump said. He's often been repeating these past days that he doesn't want to stare a gift horse in the mouth when it comes to the $110 billion arms sales concluded in the spring to Saudi Arabia. With an interview with 60 Minutes, he said, "I don't want to hurt jobs. I don't want to lose an order like that. And you know what? There are other ways of punishing." Karen Young, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there certainly are strong economic ties between the kingdom and the United States, and there is a lot at stake here. But President Trump did overblow a bit the arms sale relationship. Many of those contracts were negotiated under the Obama administration, and the figures are not quite as large as he states. All the same, Saudi Arabia is certainly a very important purchaser of American defense equipment. But Saudi Arabia also has leverage of its own. It's also one of the largest holders of American Treasury bonds. Saudi Arabia, through its sovereign wealth fund, the PIF, is heavily invested into the United States stock market. And there are obviously many, many companies that, especially in the tech sector, which are reliant on Saudi investment. So, these punitive measures can go either way, and I think the Saudi government is trying to make that point now.
Karen, are you surprised that where you are, the pressure seems to be increasing? Pierre Conessa pointing out that contrary to previous dissidents or if you want to call them critics, who've disappeared or been kidnapped or imprisoned, this time the story is not going away.
Yeah, I think that speaks to Jamal's reputation in Washington. He was and is very, very well known and among the journalist and think tank community, and certainly his home paper, the Washington Post, and his editor, Karen Attiah, have been very vigilant about keeping this story front and center in the American press. But it also, I think, hits a nerve in American politics where there is a certain uneasiness with American relationships in the Middle East, America's role in the Middle East. And this isn't something that's new about the Trump administration. This was a fatigue and a discomfort that was very, very present in the Obama administration. And the Obama administration policy of the pivot to Asia, we're still kind of dealing with that. And very much America's figuring out what and how much it wants to be tied into the region. But this, coupled with the Trump administration's Iran policy, means that Saudi Arabia has to be an important partner. So the relationship is tense.
Saudi Arabia has to be an important partner. Donald Trump in the past days pressing the Saudis to increase oil output. The U.S., though, less dependent than before on Saudi oil, as you see the numbers there. Of course, they don't like to see the price go up. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Pierre Conessa, we all remember here in France that documentary by Michael Moore after 9/11. It was called Fahrenheit 9/11, really pointing the finger at the close ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Has the relationship changed since then?
No, Saudi Arabia has shown by the past, its capability to stop any kind of investigation. Just remember that after the Senate reports about 9/11 terrorist attack, George W. Bush decided to classify 28 pages of the Senate reports. This 10 to 28 pages was pointing out that Saudi Arabia diplomats were involved with the organization of the attack. And these 28 pages have been declassified by Obama. So today there is a class action against Saudi Arabia, which means that, in fact, the problem with Trump is that he did, all his campaign denouncing the role of Saudi Arabia in the 9/11 attacks. And the first official visit after his mandate was to go to Saudi Arabia, and now you have shown, this scandalous image in which he's shaking hands with MBS, showing the amount of contracts he has signed, which means that what are you expecting from Trump? Not possible.
One of the men in that delegation that's gone to Istanbul, Khalid bin Faisal, is a Saudi prince who's an old-time insider from inside of the regime. And it's one of the questions that's being asked is right now, is everybody inside of Saudi Arabia squarely behind Mohammed bin Salman at this point?
Yeah, it's a very difficult point, but obviously, there must be opposition in a sense. Many arrested senior princes. The country was run for many, many years. This somehow absolute monarchy was run by a family consensus of important princes. And MBS, as he's called in Saudi Arabia, just broke this consensus, tries to take over power like a nationalist, Arab modernizing dictator. So there is definitely opposition. And this was exactly what Jamal Khashoggi voiced, in a sense of saying, well, it's nice to have reforms, but you can't do only authoritarian reforms and pretend to be a modernizer while you're concentrating all the power in its hand. And I would like to say a couple of sentences about Jamal. Yeah, Jamal was a Saudi nationalist. He wasn't opposing the monarchy frontally. He was, when he criticized the strongmen of the Saudi monarchy, meaning the crown prince, he was saying reforms are nice, but don't abuse of your power. He wasn't in a frontal clash with him so far. And this leads me to another point. Jamal was part of the Saudi establishment, the super Saudi elite. And he wasn't only editor-in-chief of an important paper, Al-Watan. He wasn't only a war correspondent who went to Afghanistan in the 90s and met bin Laden, tried to convince him in the Khartoum to come back to Saudi. He was also, like, for example, the personal assistant or chief advisor to Turki bin Faisal, a very important prince who used to head Saudi intelligence for about 20 years. So Jamal, we are going far beyond the hijacking of a journalism. The monarchy or the crown prince must be upset also about what Jamal knew. Somebody is so deep in the system, coming from an old family, having so much power himself, media power, Jamal, being close to Saudi intelligence, he must have known stuff about the Saudi family, which very few other people knew.
And somebody who believed in political Islam.
Political Islam is a very wide term, he was somehow religious, and he believed in a form of Islam which would be compatible with popular representation and some kind of modern system which has justice,
Right,
so saying like he was a big Muslim brother, and radical goes a little far in a certain sense, as every politics in Saudi Arabia is framed by Islam. He was advocating somehow modernizing modern Islamic version of Islam, which was might be quite close to some Muslim brothers.
We're gonna pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're discussing the pressure on Saudi Arabia and that strongly worded statement we heard out of Riyadh over the weekend, warning if you push us, we'll push back. With us to talk about it from Washington, Karen Young, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome back as well to Asyam El-Difraoui, fellow at the Candid Foundation. Academic, former defense advisor Pierre Conessa, the author of The Saudi Terror Machine, and from Beirut, Lebanese TV host Nadim Kotesh, columnist for London-based newspaper Al-Ashaq Al-Awsat. Welcome back to the show as well. Just before the break, Asyam El-Difraoui, you were talking about really what Jamal Khashoggi stood for. Nadim Kotesh, Khashoggi saying that he didn't feel safe going back to Riyadh. Why is that?
I'm not sure. I wish Jamal is among us to answer this question. But what I know is that Jamal has been, as was said in your show, a part of the media scene in Saudi Arabia. He has a very interesting CV. He made several very interesting moves. He used to be very close to Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, and then he went from the left side of Hekmatyar to the right side of Turki al-Faisal, which is a very interesting move. He had some opinions about the Islamic State, not the ISIS, but the Islamic State in the broader concept of the Islamic State. And then he moved from the Islamic State to public or popular democracy. So Jamal is not what is being presented in the media, and is on both sides. I mean, he's not the pro-Qaeda guy, and he's not the ultimate manifestation of liberalism in Saudi Arabia. He has a very interesting, very long CV. The fact that he is safe or not safe, afraid or not afraid, actually, I have no idea about that. The last time I talked to Jamal was before he left Saudi Arabia, and this was not on his agenda, actually.
Karen Young, your thoughts?
Well, I think this is correct, that the personal politics of Jamal were very diverse over his career. But the tragedy of his disappearance, we have to also put into perspective of, kind of the larger geopolitical issues that this now raises between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and those on the kind of Islamist politics of the region, including the dispute between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, particularly, and Qatar. So there are a lot of agendas
you have Turkey
at work.
and Qatar who are on one side of the argument when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other.
Along with Egypt and Bahrain as well. But yes, and so this plays into some very, very large and deep divisions within the region right now. And it also is important to keep in mind that the reason why Saudi Arabia is so sensitive of the negative press attention and the accusations against it right now is because it is in the midst of a true transformation, a revolution from above, however you want to describe it. There's a lot at stake right now for Saudi Arabia, and so this is certainly a disruption to the reform agenda. It's a disruption to the legitimacy of the Crown Prince. And this is a problem, of the highest levels of international politics.
What did you think the way that when he came back in the spring, Mohammed Bin Salman, to the United States, and he went on that barnstorming tour to tout what his Vision 2030 reform program? He had dinners, cocktails, photo ops with some of the biggest captains of industry in New York, Boston, on the West Coast. He hobnobbed with big bosses from the Silicon Valley. What were your thoughts at that time, Karen?
Well, I've written a lot about Vision 2030, and I think most of us in the United States watching the Gulf, and certainly the neighbors of Saudi Arabia, want to see Saudi Arabia succeed. This is a once kind of in a generation opportunity. And the Crown Prince represents a demographic in Saudi Arabia which is young, which wants to be well connected to media, which wants to be a member of the international community. This is something that young Saudis care a lot about. So, of course, people were optimistic, and many are still, but now there are doubts. And so the unfortunate timing of the Future Investment Initiative planned for October 22nd to 24th, and the kind of public notices of not appearing now at the conference by many leading CEOs and partners in investment in Saudi Arabia is a blow to that process and to the reform agenda.
Yeah, many CEOs announcing they were not going to that Davos in the desert conference. And again, over the weekend, the Saudis responding that if the pressure rises too much, they can strike back. Of course, Saudi Arabia, the world's top oil producer. Ivana Skatola has more on that.
For the first time in years, Saudi Arabia could be thinking about using its oil wealth as a political and economic weapon. The kingdom has said it would retaliate to any punitive measures over the disappearance of journalist Jamal Khashogghi with even stronger ones. In a statement, it pointed to its influential and vital role in the global economy, in what was a clear reference to its position as the world's biggest oil exporter. It's caused concern oil prices could surge amid the fallout. But some analysts are sceptical things will reach that point.
OPEC's share of global output has continued to decline. It's now about a third of overall oil output across the globe. So the US has alternatives. It could make life difficult, but again, it's a nuclear option for the Saudis too. The kingdom is still desperate for oil revenues. It needs it to keep everything ticking over, despite the reforms made by the Crown Prince.
Companies with close ties to the country are already feeling the impact from rising global tensions. SoftBank, a major Japanese tech company that receives tens of billions in investment capital from Riyadh, saw its shares drop 7% on Monday. It comes as JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon is the latest to pull out of Saudi Arabia's flagship investor conference, known as Davos in the Desert, following the journalist's disappearance.
One thing Saudi Arabia should have avoided doing over the last few months was to annoy its Western backers, and yet it seems to have done just yet.
He joins a growing list of major business leaders who have cancelled their plans to attend, including the executives of Uber and Ford.
You saw SoftBank mentioned in that report. You're probably wondering what the 7% fall of a financial investment firm on the Tokyo Stock Exchange has to do with this story. Turns out nearly half of SoftBank's $100 billion vision fund is bankrolled by Saudi Arabia. Quite a few of the apps in your telephone, Pierre Conessa, if you have apps, have Saudi money in them. Everything from ride-sharing service Uber to India's #1 e-commerce site Flipkart. Your thoughts on the way the Saudis have been spending their money these past couple of years?
Well, just one point for your for the information. You know that the business summit will take place in the Ritz Hotel. You know, this Ritz Hotel in which MBS took all his friends, yes, and ransomed them. Remember? So they must be very worried about that. And so, no, I think that the means that the Saudi regime has in hand today to exert pressure are quite limited, in fact. They have pushed money in several companies in Western countries. But in fact, the regime is a rental regime. I mean, they can't suddenly decide that they won't stop, anything everywhere.
They can force up the price of oil.
Yes, but the oil of the Gulf oil is going mainly to Asia. It's not going in Europe or in the United States, which means that they can exert pressure on the price. But today, you have a lot of countries which are able, to compensate, the Saudi regime. No, I think that they are quite limited in their capability to exert pressure.
Karen Young, you agree?
Not really. I mean, the problem is the timing of this controversy is right before the U.S. reimposes sanctions on Iran on November 4th. And so the cooperation on energy markets between the United States and Saudi Arabia has been to ramp up spare capacity in anticipation of declining output from Iran. And this has been where Saudi Arabia has been very cooperative and has been increasing output. And you're right, not because the U.S. buys directly from Saudi Arabia. It does not. China and Japan, South Korea are the number one, India are number one consumers. But it's a balancing of overall global oil markets that will affect the price. And so for President Trump, this is very dangerous. Not only is November 4th the reimposition of American sanctions on Iran, but it's also just 2 days before midterm congressional elections in the United States. And so the fear of wild volatility in the price of gasoline does tend to get Americans' attention, whereas they don't necessarily pay much attention to politics at large in the Middle East.
Several very short points. I also share the opinion of my colleague that Saudi Arabia doesn't have that big leverage. They're trying to diversify the economy because they need to have money getting out of foreign investment. And most importantly, they're trying to privatize their oil company, Aramco, the American Saudi oil company, which is a complicated process by itself. So this comes very bad.
Yeah, the initial public offering's been delayed several times.
Yeah, yes. They might really need to delay it further. But despite this economic aspects, it's very dangerous for the cohesion of the royal family. I mean, a lot of princes will be very upset if indeed there was killing, abduction, and a very bad public relation move. I mean, this is a princess in waiting. And I just hope we are not going to end up in some Shakespearean tragedy, like Hamlet or similar stories, or violent regicide. But this could go very, very far, especially that people are increasingly worried about the dark side of the Crown Prince of MBS. I mean, it's not his first blunder. I mean, kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, the horrible war going on in Yemen, locking up the Saudi business elite. Then at this point, the Americans needed to explain Qatar, the princes. They needed the blockades of Qatar. So Saudis, which appreciate the modernizing touch of this prince, are also very, very much worried about the dark side, where apparently this prince is not really under control and reacts in a very violent and not really a reflected way of kind.
Nadim Kotesh, you agree we could see a backlash from within the House of Saud?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Could we see a backlash from inside the House of Saud?
Against who? Against MBS or
against MBS?
No, I don't think so. First of all, let me make two very quick points concerning what was said in your panel. First of all, I'm amazed that your guest knows the fate of Prime Minister Hariri better than Prime Minister Hariri himself, who said just recently that he was not arrested, he was not kidnapped in Saudi Arabia. So unless Saad Hariri comes out and says that he was in fact arrested, but your guest obsolete. Number two, he mentioned the war in Yemen as if it was, some Saudi official woke up in the morning, finished his coffee, and then decided to go to war with Yemen. Where are the facts?
Unbelievable.
That Iran was basically, supporting al-Houthi, and the guys of al-Houthi were heading towards the south of Yemen to a very strategic point, not only for Saudi Arabia, but for the international commerce and marine lines. So basically, the way your guest is portraying things is as if, Saudi Arabia is just, a thuggish state that wakes up in the morning and decides where to go to war next. Back to your question, I don't think there is a backlash against Mohammed bin Salman. We need to keep in mind that Mohammed bin Salman is a very, very popular and strong figure in Saudi Arabia. We're not talking about Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya. This guy has created so much energy among the youth, so much energy among liberal-minded people. He did very courageous steps forward. He did mistakes. Obviously, everyone does mistakes. I do mistakes, you do mistakes, your guests in the studio do mistakes. So basically, Mohammed bin Salman is a very popular guy, very strong guy, and he has a public Saudi mandate that has never been heard before, probably since the first king of Saudi Arabia.
Asiam El Difraoui.
I like this idea about a popular mandate without elections and so on. But I don't want to get extremely personal. I mean, would you be able to criticize anything about Mohammed bin Salman? I mean, you know, like in an open democratic debate, you know, you could point to some weaknesses and you could admit to the risks that some royals might get upset, you know. But at this stage, I have more the feeling like, you know, you are working for a Saudi-owned newspaper, and I would love to have like maybe the salary also to be a spokesman for the Saudi propaganda ministry. Is there anything critical or anything, you know, which you would, you know, doubt about Saudi politics at this stage? You know, we're asking you the simple question: might there be a backlash or not? But you're just defending a prince. You're not explaining the risk he's taking. So let's really get back to serious political analysis, please. And concerning the Houthis and so on.
Karen Young.
Yeah, may I intervene? I would just say it doesn't have to be either or. I mean, we're certainly not talking about a democracy or a country in which there is a free press. But it is very clear in Saudi Arabia right now that there is a strong political culture in which an insult to the monarchy, an insult to the kingdom is taken very, very seriously. And there is retribution, and there is very, very widespread support, and how we measure it, and our opinion surveys accurate, and are people telling the truth when they're asked because they feel under pressure? Perhaps, but there is a very real sense that the Crown Prince enjoys the support of a young kingdom that looks like him, of young people who want to change in ways that he has helped happen. So from the outside, we may not agree with the, the methods, but it's very real that he has demographic support.
Yeah, as the more this current situation is very dangerous for him. I mean, even Khashoggi. Let me just finish this. Even Khashoggi was trying to make very precise criticism. He wasn't putting into question the modernizing mandate of this relatively popular crown prince. But as the more the royal family might feel dangerous, as this very positive sentiment, which was there for a long time, might flip with very unwarranted and unthoughtful actions.
Nadim Kotesh?
There is definitely a delay between you and me and in the audio, but let me make one point. Actually, the lack of information on your site's guest shouldn't make me, lecture your audience about the different sorts of political systems in the world. But yes, Saudi Arabia is not a liberal democracy. That's true. That was a very smart comment. But he missed the point that Saudi Arabia has its own mechanisms to make sure that a decision like appointing the crown prince is something democratic. There is the bay'ah mechanism. There is the bay'ah among the family, and there is the public bay'ah among the tribes. So basically, it's not France, it's not the UK, it's not the United States, but only an ignorant would deny that Mohammed bin Salman had a clear mandate in Saudi Arabia.
A clear mandate. Clear mandate from the king for certain. Pierre Conessa, just before we go, we're seeing questions being raised in the U.S. We've seen the CEO, for instance, of Uber, who gets money from SoftBank and who's not showing up. What about here in France? What about here in Europe? Well, we saw there was that joint statement over the weekend by Britain, France, and Germany. Are attitudes towards Saudi Arabia changing?
Well, just a point. I'm a little bit surprised by this debate because it seems that the Khashoggi case is just a unique case. No, a lot of people, mainly feminist women, are in jail because they have just asked you for new right in Saudi Arabia. 5 people have been condemned to death penalty because they are just demonstrated in Saudi Arabia. So how is it possible to tell those things? I mean, the journalist explaining that Khashoggi was not exactly what we think. I mean, he is a journalist. We are for the free press. So I am surprised that the correspondent of Al-Sharq Al-Awsat is exactly explaining the situation that it was doing in the communist press, you know, it's the Moscow voice. That's surprising. I mean, it's not a debate. And the second point, the point of the American women talking about the situation in Saudi Arabia. The reaction in the United States is very more significant than it is in France. I mean, a lot of peer companies have decided, you know, to give up with the contract. In France, I am waiting for Publicis and Havas and Mr. Anmeo company to decide the same. A lot of companies have decided not to attend the business summit, and in France we have 5 companies waiting to decide if they decide not to go to the...
So there are 5 French companies that are still on the list?
Yes, they are still on the list, and they have not said if they are decide to go or to, you know, to degrade, you know, their participation, which means that, in fact, the Saudi regime is quite confident.
And we were talking about, you mentioned like mechanisms of Saudi politics in terms of bay'ah, meaning swearing an oath of loyalty. I mean, all this is being broken by the actual crown prince. I mean, the consensus politics, which was a very soft consensus between different princes, between different branches of the royal family, all this is in the process of being upset. So it's fragilizing it to a certain degree in Saudi Arabia. And moreover, taking account is modernizing politics, where there's a huge consistency in Saudi society, which is quite upset about this modernizing politics, Wahhabi, traditionalists, and so on and so on. So we definitely need to agree on the fact that the current events are not inductive to stability in Saudi Arabia.
A story that's going to continue to play out. Asiam El-Difraoui, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Pierre Connaissant. I want to thank Karen Young for joining us from Washington, D.C. Nadim Kotesh in Beirut. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Different narratives on this story playing out.
Extremely different narratives, depending upon where you look, as is always the case with social media and online nowadays. But we're starting to see messages like this appear from Saudi Arabia. We proudly stand with our country against any threat and fake news that tries to cause harm to us. Now, that comes in the wake of Saudi Arabia itself talking about fake news and how they actually plan to prosecute those who continue to spread it. And that can include people who've just liked a tweet, because it talks about saving things on social media. And of course, if you like something, you can immediately access it. And people are concerned that what they're talking about in terms of punishment is 5 years in prison or some really very heavy fines.
For liking a tweet?
Potentially, yes. I mean, obviously this hasn't happened yet, so we will have to wait and see just how much they actually do follow through with these threats. But it does look as though certainly Saudi Arabia wanting to take action against those tweets and those articles that they are not happy with at all. What is interesting to see is the other kinds of things being said. This woman saying, just to be clear, talking about Jamal's murder would be deemed a rumour and so now a crime in Saudi. Good luck, Godspeed to those attending Davos in the desert, of course, which is the financial gathering that a lot of people are now pulling out of. And of course, people may well be looking at what those people are saying on social media before they travel to Saudi Arabia. We just don't know how much this is actually going to be policed, but certainly they're talking about taking on the rumour mongers. In the Saudi Gazette, we have this article that's just been written saying just because he is Saudi. And they say this is basically a direct campaign targeting Saudi Arabia. It's got very little to do with Jamal Khashoggi himself. They talk about the fact that nobody minded other disappearances or eliminations, including in Turkey itself, where, of course, hundreds of journalists have been locked up in prison. And he says that the world's sleeping conscience has finally been awakened, certainly a very sarcastic take on this. And he insists that the international media, and he names France 24 among them, are not neutral, lacking in principles and morals when they side with lobbies that are bought by money. And he talks about a war that has to be won with all the tools that they have available to them. Of course, they can criticise and deride, but they can't actually stop what people are doing overseas. Sabah, the Turkish newspaper, has a report in it today talking about how they believe that the arrival of the Saudis was actually rehearsed to see whether they could get that black van into the underground garage, undercover, out of the view of any CCTV cameras on the street and the like. Borzu Deragahi has been keeping an eye on the feeds coming from the consulate today, and he spotted that before Turkish investigators actually arrived, we saw a team of cleaners heading into the consulate. So, of course,
Monday could be cleaning day.
It could be cleaning day. It may just be coincidental.
All right.
However, you do have to wonder how detailed that investigation is going to be if the whole area has been cleaned.
All right, many thanks for that. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.